So we've played around with different selections, and we've played around with creating pattern. Let's see how we could start to use some of that knowledge. So first of all, if I was just to use the paint bucket tool for the moment, and I was to click anywhere on this image, I'm going to fill this image with a pattern. And just as before, what we need to think about is what's happening. At the moment, the pattern is being defined by the tolerance. How many pixels are the same colour or variation of colour? If I go undo for the moment. So there's subtle variations of colour within here, and that's because this figure is quite small. If I make that smaller still, and then use the paint bucket tool, only a small area of my image will be defined by a pattern. If I go through my history and just undo that, taking it back to the beginning again, if I was to make a selection, so this time I could use my quick selection tool, and define this area. If I was then to use my paint bucket tool in there, I will fill that area. Again, obviously the tolerance setting here is quite low. So if I change that to a much higher figure, now my pattern will be defined. Now that I've deselected, I could use the quick selection to select another part of my image, and then again use the paint bucket tool to select. Now if you remember that when I created the patterns, I missed a little bit of the edge, and you can see that edge coming through. It's a bit of a shame about that. I wasn't obviously careful enough to delete that edge, but just to sort of show you, the other thing that I did was I created a different version of the pattern. Underneath here you can see that's version number 1, that's version number 2. If I now use the quick selection tool under here, need to make sure I've deselected the previous area. So if I now select this area and use this pattern, you can see that the scale of that pattern is very, very different, and that's because I resized the whole of the pattern. Now this is particularly useful when you're working with creating patterns based on your own textiles. It's very important to consider the scale of your pattern in relationship to the scale of the body. I'm going to select this area through here. Again, I've already got this area selected, so I can't select this until I've deselected this. But actually, while I've kept that selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the hue of that pattern. And I'm also going to alter the saturation of that image too. If I now choose my quick selection tool, deselecting the previous area, and then select underneath here, I can choose this again to have some pattern inside. Clearly the coloration of this is the previous coloration, so if I want to get it something similar to this already, I've got to again change the hue and saturation settings. Deselect. Finally this area over here, again quickly selecting that area before it's defined with this pattern. Now once I'm happy with the pattern, you can see one of the things that's happened is that the pictorial space of the image has changed. I might now start to manipulate the colour of this image. Deselecting again, what I'm now going to do is I'm going to very quickly select my figure. So go back to the selection tool. This time I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool to very quickly select around the edge of the figure. Copy, paste. If I look at my layers palette over here, you can see if I switch my background off, I've selected the figure, but I've also clearly selected some of the background. So this is where I might use my quick selection tool to select some of these areas of pattern and hit backspace. I might choose to change to my rubber and erase. And again, it's useful to remember that if I use the shift key, I can move my rubber to one location to the next. So if I press the shift key down now, and then move, move again, move again, move again, I can start to kind of join up, as it were, the dots. Remember, if I've gone too far, I can always look at my history and undo some of the previous steps that I've made. Now that this area has been cleaned up, I could start to work with my brushes. And I could start to colorize my image. Now this time it's important to remember that when I'm going to use the paint bucket tool, that I change back from my pattern setting to my foreground setting, so that's this colour here. And again, I'm going to undo that command because my tolerance at this stage is far too strong and my contiguous button is unchecked. So let's just drop that down to a much lower figure. And now you can see I've started to colorise the clothing. Here where the pencil marks have kind of put shading down, that's not been fully colorised. Sometimes having a really low tolerance setting can produce some interesting colour areas of your image too. So if I drop that down to a lower figure, just to put some coloration in parts. And again, what I could do is uncheck contiguous and then click in areas, which means that any areas which are that colour will be filled with colour. Once I'm satisfied with my digital drawing, I can now go back to my layers and I can make my background layer visible. And now I can decide whether I'm happy with the finished image or again whether I wish to change all the background. This time I could choose my background and I could manipulate obviously the hue and saturation of the whole background. I might reduce the saturation of all of it down to produce my final piece of illustration work.